Gothic Reviews. Today we're going to review the classic cult horror Hellraiser by Clive Barker. This work of cinema and I personally think art has many interesting elements to recommend it. First of all, there are different mythological symbols that show up throughout the book, but in my opinion, one of the ideas to look through is how different elements of this movie contrast with each other and how they work together. And that's what I'm going to do, to give my brief review first and then a thorough analysis of the movie that also contains spoilers, so if you want to stop at this point, feel free. But if you came here, you probably already know a little bit about Hellraiser, so I probably will not be spoiling the surprise factor for you. But unlike many traditional horrors, Clive Barker does not rely solely on the surprise factor. There are definitely twists in the plot, there are unexpected actions, and there are visual aspects of horror too, but I think primarily he focuses on that psychological aspect of horror that makes the horror work the way it does. So, in most cases of horror movies that I can think about, there is to an extent this illusion of safety that we know is going to be betrayed in the very beginning when the first victim dies, usually in brutal ways, and we're looking forward to it. But I think Clive Barker does it a little bit differently. Instead of the illusion, he creates a whole mythology, the mythology where the real world as we, the viewer, know it, stands on the outside and becomes in part mythological for us. All the common relationships between father and daughter, brother and brother, husband and wife, they acquire a mythological element, a factor of faith for somebody looking from the other side. And they are not real. They cannot experience all those factors in themselves. They don't know what it's like. They believe that something like Father Knows Best, like a 50s TV show that represents the idealized father, it's entirely fake. What they believe to be true are the things that can be experienced physically, for one, the reality of pain, the reality of denial, hurtful relationships where only mutual benefit is the bond that cements relationship. And we can see all of that through the eyes of different characters. Even the most positive of the characters, they portray a certain grim outlook. And it's not necessarily that the whole outcome of the movie is bad either. That's not the point. The point is that the entire worldview of this movie, as we're watching it, it begins to look a little bit skewed. It's somebody on the outside seeing the world as we commonly perceive it, but seeing it as a sort of idealized and unrealistic picture. And there are interesting contrasting elements at the very beginning of the movie, and that's where I'm going to provide many spoilers. We see this oriental-looking character that reminds us a little of Mr. Miyagi mixed with Shang Tsung, and with all of their powers, abilities, but also a little bit maybe on the evil side, where he asks, "What is your pleasure?" And it's very interesting because it immediately goes into a person who we later understand to be Frank Cotton, one of the main characters in the movie. He is getting his pleasure, but he's getting his pleasure by going paradoxically to the utmost of the extreme of hurt, of self-abuse, self-mutilation, because he explored all the other boundaries. And to make matters even more interesting, other than this pleasure and pain connotation that goes throughout all the movies like a common thread throughout the Hellraiser universe, we also see a contrast between how Frank is offered all the pleasure while Julia, the wife of his brother Larry, and his mistress, is denying Larry all of his pleasure. So there is this contrast between pleasure, how you receive pleasure, how pleasure is denied, who is giving it, and in what context, usually the context of horror, and where sexuality and horror are mixed together because sexuality becomes part of pleasure, part of power, part of self-expression, but it is used often in hurtful context. And even our most positive character, the survival of the movie, Kirsty, she is experiencing the world a little bit on the outside, as I said in the beginning. You see her trying tentatively to experiment with a flirtatious relationship where somebody is offering her a drink. It almost seems like a common dating condition, dating scenario, but not quite. And she seems skeptical and hesitant about it. And my personal interpretation of her is that she might have been subject to abuse herself, because all the images she receives, it's of a flower opening that speaks in part of body and sexuality. It's of that fear where she expresses her contempt of her uncle, not by being horrified that he is back from the dead, but by insisting that he does not touch her, which is an indicative sign for those of us who have seen such cases that it is a fear that he did touch her in the past, and being who he is frank, he probably hurt in some way, either physically or more likely, just as likely, sexually. And she does not know the world that we know either. Kirsty does not, and that's why every time, time after time, she keeps accidentally, it is true that it is accidental, it is true that she's the good character, but she still reaches for the puzzle box. Because like the rest of the characters in the movie, she keeps looking on the outside. She keeps seeing our world as something that she would like to be part of, and that's her main difference from the others. But she is not really part of it at this point, at the point of her adventure. She is still an outsider. She's looking from behind the glass scene type of thing that separates her from the real world. Just like those of us who are outcasts may be separated from normality to an extent, or the way we perceive ourselves at least, and that's how she appears to perceive herself. And the only character who is fully integrated into our world seems to be her father, Larry. He seems to, or either he really believes in all the good values, he seems like a decent fellow at least. He tries to have decent relationship as a father, as a husband, to an extent maybe as a brother too, but none of this, well, his relationship with Kirsty works out, of course, but despite all of those elements, he is not able to fully utilize the capacity of this world, even though he is seemingly a good fellow, and maybe he is, and there is nothing to contradict that he ever was. He is drawn to somebody like Julia. So the first question you could ask, like, what's up with that? How somebody who is really, really genuinely nice would be drawn to a character like her? Why, of all people? And she seems to have certain sexual appeal to people, but at this movie, the first installment where she shows up, she does not appear to be too attractive in the conventional sense. She doesn't even seem to be that useful to be a model of attraction. If anything, I would say that she perhaps, to some unconscious degree, might imitate some kind of a maternal figure for Larry, and that would be the only source of his attraction to her, to the point where she fulfills a role that he probably did not receive in his childhood. It is my impression that neither him nor his brother Frank were able to receive good maternal guidance. I'm not sure exactly that it was specifically stated, but this is my general impression based on different elements of the story, where they have a certain lack of femininity that's usually associated with those who have a healthy mother role model. So the other characters in the movie, like Frank and Julia, they of course are entirely outsiders. Frank more than most. He was the first to explore the boundaries of the other world, the boundary of the real world. For him, the real world, of course, being the world of pain, and he transcended it, and he found pleasure on the other side. And that's the other aspect of the Cenobite order, that Pinhead does not say accidentally that we are angels to some and demons to others. He does seem a lot like the bringer of illumination. He is the revealer of truth, and truth is not necessarily pleasant always about a person. Sometimes it's painful. And Frank, of course, revels in pain, so he discovers more and more dimensions of pain. Others are not so much. They are a little bit stuck on our side of the world, on the real world, so they are less drawn to pain, except perhaps unconsciously. So then we have, other than Frank, we have also Julia, and she is also an outsider. You can see little signs. She's not as firmly entrenched in the world of the dark side, as it were. She's trying to be in our world, she's just not working out. And there are subtle signs in the very beginning what happens to her. She's trying to play the doting wife, but when push comes to shove, she really refuses the role of the wife. She does not want to do her wifely duties, not physically, indulge in Larry's sexual appetites, not practically. When he needs some support, he needs her to bring something, she's unable to bring his beer. And some people would consider like strong femininity, and that's fine, it's everybody's opinion, but she always seems only tentatively on the edge. She doesn't seem to be comfortable in social settings either. She's a little weary of Larry's friends when they come for a visit. She smiles very strangely. She already has that element of mystery where she is involved with Larry's brother Frank, and certainly that adds a little bit to her hesitation, but still, all of the signs point to the fact that she is another outsider to the real world. She is just trying to play a role, she's really trying to hold it together, but as soon as the real temptation comes, she entirely falls apart and follows Frank into the dark side, where he becomes her guide. And again, this whole idea, this is the psychology of the movie, where our world, the world as we know it, is just an illusion, where only pain is real, only extreme physical sensations are realistic, because they can be directly experienced, directly controlled, subject to expectation, and they give us a sense of power. So almost every character to some degree in this movie partakes of this attitude. And this is not just the first movie, all the subsequent installments in the series clearly show a similar kind of attitude, with perhaps the exception of Kirsty, who always firmly tries to denounce. She does whatever she has to stay on our side. She's only a visitor on our side. She is a little bit stuck on the other side too, on the side of the dark, where she knows too well because possibly of her abuse. But she is trying to get out of it. She's trying to make a positive change and to reach for our side, and for that reason, every time, again and again, she triumphs and she rejects the puzzle box and its mystery. And the funny thing is that, unlike everybody else, she might sometimes be the youngest, but she knows the truth, that she already knows that mystery. She doesn't need it. She knows that it's about pain, and she wants something better, I think. And her name and all the other names are chosen very carefully. Apparently, Kirsty is a name that is derived from Christine and has those associations with Christian. So she's like a sort of kind of a Christ figure in this movie. And it makes it more realistic because she's not all powerful at all. She doesn't have the ability to save many people, but she certainly has the intention to keep trying again and again for herself, for the sake of that little girl that we meet later on in a different movie, for the sake of her husband, for all kinds of people around her. She's trying to save them. She doesn't have the power, but she has the determination to keep protecting herself, and that is very suitable perhaps for that choice of a name. Her father, Larry, is named perhaps ironically. It derives from the Latin word Laurentium, which itself derives from laurels. And you all know that mythological story of Apollo and Daphne and the laurels of victory. And the whole idea is that Larry would mean something indirectly like victorious, is ironic, of course. And because he pretty much loses everything. He loses his wife, his relationship, his daughter, and his very existence. Maybe even his soul, who knows. But hopefully not, because unlike his brother, he really is trying to be a good guy. Then there's Frank, which is kind of funny. As the word Frank is supposed to mean honest, but he could be as deceitful as you could get if it serves his purpose. And Julia is also another interesting name, because the very first Julia in history that we hear of is named after her father, Julius Caesar. So she's supposed to be the model of the doting daughter, which is clearly, ironically, undermined at every point of the story. She is anything but doting in every sort of relationship she is. And even though she genuinely seems to be drawn to Frank, the relationship between them is unhealthy enough for her to care deeply about it. At the same time, even at this point, she is doing things for him unwillingly, and she is never doting. So, in most cases, the names are ironic, but the only one who truly prevails, Kirsty, is named appropriately because she always, at the end, wins. Even when it doesn't seem so, even when it seems like that she is on the losing side, that she is surprised, that she is hurt, all of those things are true, but she always wins to her own resourcefulness and devices, and it's rather nice that there is a positive female character to balance out all the other traditionally negative models of female sexuality and assertiveness that are fake and prove no use in everyday existence. Kirsty's femininity or aggression or assertiveness, they're always to the point, to the goal of defending herself, and for that reason she is an admirable character. And to underscore the fact of the mythological associations, we could look also at Hellraiser as another retelling of certain familiar themes. For instance, in this movie we meet a deformed individual who rises to life, and is appropriately named Frank, which is definitely reminiscent of the Frankenstein figure. And we even have, from a similar era, we have a Renfield character, because the homeless guy that we see eating bugs is definitely reminiscent of that. There is the vampiric associations, because Frank is not allowed to come in without being welcomed first by the owner of the house, which is what we know of vampires. And Renfield, being a servant of the foremost vampire, Count Dracula, of course, is confirming this particular association. There is the idea of blood giving strength, as happens to vampires. And there are probably even more associations. It's very interesting that each time that I watch this movie, new layers of meaning are revealed to me. So when I think I got it, finally I understand the entire movie, I can analyze every element. There's this layer, and that's part of why this horror becomes a classic horror movie, really, because it's hard to imagine anybody else to be able to pack so much psychology into traditional horror framework. Indirectly, we can also discuss certain astrological associations in the movie. For example, Frank and Larry, the two brothers, are reminiscent in part of the twins that carry different functions. The Gemini constellation, its foundational myth, some of you might know, has to do with Castor and Pollux, or Polydeuces as the Greeks call him. And one of them is the more aggressive type and the other is the more tame type, and that is definitely true for Larry and Frank, because Larry is the passive to Frank's aggressive. And Then there is also the astrological connotation of Aries showing up. You might remember certain myths associated with this constellation, the Greek pantheon, where there is an attempt to disguise Enos children for those of Themisto, and that disguise concept is also encountered in the Hellraiser movie, where Frank attempts to wear basically Larry's face for his own, which is a type of a mask when you think about it, a type of disguise. And of course, Kirsty is not fooled by it. But in the original myth, the original character, the father of the children, Athamas, was indeed fooled by it because of the madness of Dionysus. But still, there are definitely similarities. And even though you could think, well, it's kind of contrived, because there are so many other mythological associations, this connection seems to be very strong and confirmed more than once. So Hellraiser has that mythology, but I really think that the idea of how we get to see how the whole worldview is skewed, how pleasure is derived in their own ways, how there are outsiders who are peeking into our world, and the puzzle box serves them as a portal to explore our world because they don't know it, and they're reaching for it and don't even know it. They don't even understand that they're always on the outside. They're thinking that this is just another adventure I'm going to try, in Kirsty's case, or a new experience, but in reality it is an entirely unknown territory to many of them, because they're so firmly on the dark side that they don't know that they could be anywhere, but they consider that to be the natural order of things. And the more we see through their perspective, the more we see that it actually maybe differs from ours, or if not from ours as the fans of the Hellraiser franchise, maybe from the everyday citizen at least. And finally, a fairy tale association that I like is, of course, that is pretty typical, but still, Julia is basically a stepmother to Kirsty, so the connotations of the evil queen and the fairy tale, all the fairy tales that have to do with it. So it's very, all of it is very mythological, interconnected. There is the regular myths, the astrological ones, the psychological, mythological dimensions, lots of depth to it. And that's why this is not an ordinary slasher and so nice to watch. And other than that, there is also perhaps an illuminated message that is introduced in the very beginning, where the Asian guy who happens to have the puzzle box tells Frank that it was always yours. It's kind of interesting because it implies that yes, bad things happen, but he was already on that path for such a long time that he always belonged there. That kind of a thing is not happening to us. Just because our expectations of safety, our values, everything can be changed, it doesn't mean that we would experience the same fate. It only happens to those descendants of the dark side who are looking into our world from the outside. So, for all those reasons, for all the depth involved, I really enjoyed Hellraiser. I would recommend the watching of it to any typical horror fan. It has a little bit less, maybe, horror visual elements that people are used to, especially by modern standards with all the graphics, but I thought it was still pretty picturesque. It was never entirely random. The designs were always very geometrical. Even when they were retellings of old motifs, they were always in different ways, typical of the original Clive Barker mythology, who is one of the best horror writers I know. So I would suggest that you watch this movie, that you watch every single one of them. Even some fans would not consider it traditional, but still, even the remake, that this is still consistent with the framework of the Hellraiser universe. And this movie is just called Hellraiser. Most of the others have a subtitle introduced later, most of the sequels, but this one is just Hellraiser by itself. and you should probably watch it and enjoy all the different elements juxtaposed together. This has been Gothic Review. We were reviewing Hellraiser by Clive Barker. If you enjoyed it or want to see more Hellraiser reviews for sequels, please like us, subscribe or share. Thank you.